The wind cut through downtown Denver like a blade, carrying the scent of snow and exhaust fumes as Steve Miller jogged across the 16th Street Bridge at 6:47 a.m. His worn running shoes pounded against the concrete in a steady rhythm that had become his morning meditation, the only time his mind found peace from the constant worry about rent, groceries, and whether Tommy had enough for the school field trip next week. The rejection email from Harrison Tech still burned in his pocket from yesterday, another polite thank you for your interest that felt more like a door slamming shut than professional courtesy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what he saw next made him forget everything else. A woman in an expensive gray coat stood on the wrong side of the bridge railing, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the metal as the morning traffic rushed past below. Her designer heels were lined up neatly on the sidewalk behind her, as if she'd planned every detail of this moment with the same precision she probably brought to board meetings. Steve's military training kicked in before his conscious mind could process what was happening. This wasn't someone crying for help or making a scene. This was someone who had made a decision and was about to act on it. Everything slowed down. The honking cars became distant background noise. The early commuters walking past with their coffee and phones might as well have been invisible. There was only this moment, this woman, and the choice Steve had to make in the next few seconds. His legs carried him forward before he could think about the consequences, before he could remember that his own life was barely hanging together by a thread. Steve approached slowly, his hands visible and his voice calm in the way that had once talked panicked soldiers down from emotional ledges in Afghanistan. "Hey there," he said, stopping about 10 feet away so he wouldn't startle her. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? I love how the mountains look when the sun hits them just right." The woman's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. Her dark hair whipped in the wind, and he could see her knuckles had gone white from gripping the rail so tightly. "Don't," she said without looking back, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she was used to people listening when she spoke. "Just keep running. Pretend you didn't see anything." But Steve had spent 3 tours overseas watching good people make permanent solutions to temporary problems. And he'd learned that sometimes the difference between life and death was whether someone cared enough to stay when things got ugly. "I'm Steve," he said, settling into a position where he could move quickly if needed but far enough away that she didn't feel trapped. "And I'm not going anywhere. Not because I'm trying to be a hero or anything dramatic like that. I'm staying because I've been where you are right now, and I know how alone it feels when you're standing on that edge." The morning commuters continued their rush past them, most too absorbed in their phones to notice the life-and-death conversation happening just feet away. The woman finally turned her head slightly, and Steve caught a glimpse of her profile. Something about her face seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. "You don't know anything about where I am," she said, but there was less conviction in her voice now, as if his words had found a crack in whatever wall she'd built around herself. "Maybe not," Steve admitted, keeping his tone conversational and steady. "But I know what it's like to feel like you've lost everything that mattered. I know what it's like to wake up every morning wondering if you're strong enough to make it through another day. I know what it's like to think that everyone around you would be better off if you just disappeared." He paused, watching her carefully for any sign that she might jump, but also letting his words sink in. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 3 years ago, I was standing on a different bridge in this same city, having a very similar conversation with myself. The only difference was that nobody stopped to talk to me. I had to figure it out on my own, and let me tell you, that was the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than anything I faced in the army, harder than losing my wife, harder than anything. But I'm glad I didn't jump that night, because my son needed me to stick around, even when I couldn't see it at the time. The woman's grip on the railing loosened slightly as Steve's words hung in the cold morning air. She turned around fully for the first time, and Steve felt his stomach drop as recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. Rachel Thompson, the CEO of Harrison Tech. The woman whose perfectly composed photograph had stared back at him from the company website just yesterday when he'd researched the executives after his rejection. The same woman who had personally signed the email declining his application for head of security, citing his lack of corporate experience despite his military background. "You," she said, her eyes widening as she recognized him too. The business suit from his interview had been replaced by running clothes, but apparently his face had made enough of an impression during their brief meeting last week. "You're the veteran who applied for the security position, Steve Miller." Her voice carried a mixture of surprise and something else he couldn't quite identify. Shame, maybe. Steve nodded slowly, his mind racing. Of all the people in Denver who could have been standing on this bridge at dawn, contemplating the worst decision of their life, it had to be her. The woman who had looked at his resume filled with commendations, combat experience, and leadership roles, and decided he wasn't qualified to protect her company. The irony wasn't lost on him that she now needed protecting from herself. "Yeah, that's me," he said, maintaining the same calm tone despite the emotions churning in his chest. The guy who apparently doesn't have enough corporate experience to handle security for a tech company but somehow has enough life experience to talk someone down from a bridge. He immediately regretted the bitterness in his voice. This wasn't the time for wounded pride or settling scores. Rachel's face crumpled slightly and she looked away. "I remember your interview. You seemed intense. Overqualified, actually. My board felt you might not adapt well to civilian corporate culture after your military service." The words sounded hollow even as she spoke them, as if she was reciting something she'd been told rather than something she believed. Steve almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Intense, right, because heaven forbid someone who's actually seen real threats might take security seriously. He caught himself again, forcing his anger down. This woman was in crisis, and his personal grievances could wait. "Look, I'm not here to relitigate my job interview. I'm here because you looked like you were about to make a decision that can't be undone, and I've been in enough dark places to know that most problems that feel permanent really aren't." For a moment, they stood in silence as the city woke up around them. Cars honked in the distance, and the smell of coffee drifted up from the street vendors setting up their carts. Normal life continuing while two broken people faced each other across a chasm of misunderstanding and pain. Steve thought about the path that had led him to this bridge, to this moment. 3 years ago, he'd been Sergeant Steve Miller, leading a security detail in Kandahar province. His team had been responsible for protecting supply convoys moving between forward operating bases. Dangerous work that required split-second decisions and absolute trust in your brothers beside you. He'd been good at it, the kind of soldier who brought everyone home alive because he could see threats others missed and react before thinking became a luxury they couldn't afford. Lisa had been waiting for him back home in Colorado Springs, working as a nurse at the VA hospital while raising their son, Tommy, who'd been barely 2 when Steve deployed for his final tour. She'd written him letters every week, filled with stories about Tommy's first words, his first steps, the way he would point at airplanes and say "Daddy," because she'd told him that's how Daddy would come home. Those letters had kept Steve sane through months of IED attacks, mortar rounds, and the constant stress of knowing that any routine patrol could be the one that didn't end well. The injury that ended his military career hadn't even happened during combat. A training accident at the base, a piece of equipment that failed at exactly the wrong moment, and suddenly Steve was looking at medical discharge papers and a Purple Heart he'd never wanted. The shrapnel in his back hadn't been life-threatening, but it had been career-ending. Chronic pain, limited mobility, and hands that shook when the weather changed. The Army doctors had been kind but clinical. He could still walk, still function, but he couldn't pass the physical requirements for active duty anymore. Coming home should have been a celebration. Instead, it had felt like failure. Lisa had tried to help him adjust, had been patient with his nightmares and his anger and the way he'd flinch at loud noises or scan every room for exits. She'd gotten him into therapy, helped him apply for disability benefits, supported him through the long process of figuring out who he was when he wasn't Sergeant Miller anymore. But the adjustment had been harder than either of them expected. The construction accident that killed Lisa had been random, senseless, one of those tragedies that proved the universe didn't care about fairness or who deserved what. A crane operator who'd had a heart attack. A load of steel beams that fell exactly where Lisa happened to be walking to her car after a late shift at the hospital. Steve had been at home with Tommy, reading him a bedtime story about brave knights and dragons when the call came. One moment he'd been doing silly voices and making his son giggle, the next he'd been staring at his phone while a stranger's voice explained that his wife was gone. The months that followed had been a blur of funeral arrangements, well-meaning casseroles from neighbors, and the impossible task of explaining to a 4-year-old why Mommy wasn't coming home anymore. Steve had barely functioned, getting through each day on autopilot while Tommy cried for his mother, and Steve wondered how he was supposed to raise a child alone when he could barely take care of himself. The life insurance had helped with immediate expenses, but it wasn't enough for long-term stability. Steve had started applying for security jobs, thinking his military experience would be an asset in the corporate world. Instead, he discovered that civilian employers saw his background as a liability. Too rigid, they said. Too used to following orders rather than thinking creatively. Overqualified for entry-level positions. Underqualified for management roles that required business degrees and corporate experience he'd never had the chance to gain. The rejections had piled up like unpaid bills. Mall security jobs that paid barely above minimum wage but required him to work nights and weekends when Tommy needed him most. Corporate positions that wanted someone with an MBA rather than someone who'd actually stopped real threats in real-world situations. Government contractor roles that demanded security clearances that had lapsed during his medical discharge process. Each rejection had felt like another door closing, another reminder that the skills that had kept soldiers alive apparently meant nothing in the civilian world. Rachel, meanwhile, had grown up in a world where doors opened automatically. Her father, Michael Thompson, had built Harrison Tech from a small software consultancy into one of Denver's largest technology companies, specializing in cybersecurity solutions for Fortune 500 companies. She'd grown up in boardrooms, had learned to read financial statements before she could drive, and had always known that someday the company would be hers to run. But knowing something intellectually was different from living it emotionally. When her father had his stroke 2 years ago, Rachel had been thrust into the CEO role at 28, younger than most of her direct reports, and facing constant questions about whether she'd earned her position or simply inherited it. The company had been struggling with a series of high-profile security breaches at client companies, breaches that had nothing to do with Harrison Tech's software, but everything to do with public perception and confidence in the cybersecurity industry as a whole. The board had been breathing down her neck for months, demanding results and threatening to bring in outside management if she couldn't turn things around. Every decision felt scrutinized, every mistake magnified, every success attributed to her father's foundation rather than her own leadership. She'd been working 18-hour days, sleeping in her office more often than her penthouse apartment, and living on a diet of coffee and stress that was slowly destroying her from the inside. The lawsuit that had pushed her over the edge had come out of nowhere. A former employee claiming harassment, discrimination, and wrongful termination. The allegations were false. Rachel knew that with absolute certainty. But in the current climate, the accusation alone was enough to trigger investigations, media attention, and the kind of publicity nightmare that could destroy everything her father had built. The employee, David Harrison, had been fired for cause after being caught selling client information to competitors. But his lawyer had crafted a narrative that painted Rachel as an unstable young woman who'd targeted him because he'd rejected her advances. The story was absurd to anyone who knew Rachel, but it didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, the young female CEO who'd inherited her position was an easy target, and David Harrison was a sympathetic victim fighting against corporate power. The media had picked up the story with gleeful enthusiasm, running headlines about nepotism and abuse of power that made Rachel's stomach turn every time she saw them. Last night, the board had held an emergency meeting. They'd given her an ultimatum: settle the lawsuit for whatever Harrison wanted, regardless of the cost or the admission of guilt it implied, or face a vote of no confidence that would remove her from the position she'd worked her entire life to deserve. Either way, she'd lose. Either she'd be remembered as the CEO who caved to false accusations, or she'd be remembered as the CEO who destroyed her father's legacy through stubbornness and pride. Standing on that bridge as the sun rose over Denver, Rachel had felt like she was out of options. The company would survive without her, probably better off with someone who hadn't been tainted by scandal. Her father was too ill to understand what was happening, and her mother had been out of the picture since Rachel was 12. There was no one depending on her, no one who would be worse off if she simply disappeared. It had seemed like the cleanest solution to an impossible problem. But now, looking at Steve Miller, the veteran she'd rejected just days ago, Rachel realized that maybe she'd been wrong about more than just the impossibility of her situation. Maybe she'd been wrong about a lot of things. Steve watched as Rachel carefully climbed back over the railing, her movements deliberate and controlled even in her moment of crisis. She smoothed down her coat and slipped her feet back into her designer heels, transforming instantly from a woman on the edge to a composed executive. But Steve could see the tremor in her hands and the way her breathing hadn't quite steadied yet. "Coffee?" he asked simply, nodding toward a small diner visible from the bridge. "I know a place that serves breakfast all day, and I'm betting neither of us has eaten anything substantial lately." Rachel looked at him with surprise, as if she'd expected him to lecture her or demand explanations she wasn't ready to give. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. "I rejected your application. I basically told you that your military service wasn't valuable enough for my company. You should be angry with me." Steve considered her question as they began walking slowly toward the diner. "I am angry," he admitted, "but not at you exactly. I'm angry at a system that makes combat veterans feel worthless in civilian jobs. I'm angry at companies that claim they support military families but won't give us real opportunities. But you personally? You're just trying to run a business and make decisions based on what your advisors tell you is best." He paused at the crosswalk, studying her face. "Besides, anger doesn't help anyone right now. You need support, not judgment." The diner was one of those timeless places that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1970s, with red vinyl booths and a waitress named Dolores who called everyone honey and poured coffee without being asked. Steve ordered pancakes and eggs, while Rachel stared at the menu like it was written in a foreign language. "When's the last time you ate?" Steve asked gently, and Rachel's pause told him everything he needed to know. "Dolores, could we get some toast and fruit for the lady?" Something easy on the stomach. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the normalcy of the diner gradually easing the tension between them. Steve watched Rachel wrap her hands around her coffee mug like she was trying to absorb its warmth, and he recognized the bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying too much weight for too long. "Tell me about your son," Rachel said suddenly, surprising them both. "You mentioned him on the bridge." Steve's face softened immediately. "Tommy. He's 6 now, 1st grade. Kid's got more energy than a nuclear reactor, and asks about 1,000,000 questions a day. Currently obsessed with dinosaurs and convinced that if he practices hard enough, he can teach our goldfish to do tricks." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Rachel found herself smiling for the first time in days. "What's it like?" she asked. "Being a single parent, I mean. It must be terrifying, being responsible for someone else's entire world." "Terrifying doesn't begin to cover it." Steve laughed, but his expression grew serious. "Every decision I make affects him. Every job I don't get means fewer opportunities for him. Every time I lose my temper or have a bad day, he sees it and absorbs it. But it's also the most important thing I've ever done. More important than any mission I ran overseas. More important than any medal I earned. He needs me to be better than I think I can be, so I find ways to be better." Rachel stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "I've never had anyone depend on me like that. My whole life I've been the one depending on others. My father's reputation, my board's approval, my shareholders' confidence. I've never been someone's whole world." "That doesn't make your life less valuable," Steve said firmly. "Just different. And from what I've read about Harrison Tech, you've got a lot of employees who depend on you for their livelihoods, their healthcare, their kids' college funds. That's a different kind of responsibility, but it's still real." Over the next hour, they found themselves talking with a candor that surprised them both. Rachel told Steve about the lawsuit, about David Harrison's false accusations, and the board's ultimatum. She explained how she'd built her entire identity around being worthy of her father's legacy, only to watch it crumble under allegations she couldn't fight without appearing guilty. "The worst part," she said, picking at her toast, "is that I don't even know if I want to be a CEO. I've never asked myself that question because it was always just assumed. My father groomed me for this role from the time I could walk, and I've spent so many years trying to prove I deserved it that I never stopped to consider whether I actually wanted it." Steve understood that feeling more than she might expect. "I spent 8 years in the Army because it gave me purpose and structure and a clear sense of right and wrong. When that ended, I felt completely lost. Not just professionally, but existentially. Who was I if I wasn't Sergeant Miller? What value did I have if my skills weren't needed anymore? He paused, remembering those dark months after Lisa's death. It took me a long time to realize that finding new purpose doesn't mean abandoning everything you've learned or everything you've been. It means building on it. The conversation continued as they walked out of the diner and through downtown Denver. Rachel showed Steve the Harrison Tech building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that dominated several city blocks. 34 floors, she said with a mixture of pride and weariness. My office is on the top floor, corner suite with views of the mountains. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a fishbowl up there, with everyone watching to see if I'll succeed or fail. Steve studied the building with professional interest. Security cameras on every entrance, but the landscaping creates blind spots near the loading dock. Badge access, but I'm betting your executive parking garage doesn't have adequate lighting. And that main lobby is beautiful. But it's also a security nightmare with all that open space and glass. Rachel stared at him, realizing that in 30 seconds he'd identified vulnerabilities that her current security team had never mentioned. You really do know what you're talking about, she said softly. I made a mistake not hiring you, didn't I? Maybe, Steve said diplomatically. But I also understand why you didn't. On paper, I probably looked like a risk. Military guys can be inflexible, and you needed someone who could adapt to corporate culture. He gestured toward the building. The question is whether you need someone who follows corporate protocols, or someone who actually knows how to keep people safe. As they continued their impromptu tour of downtown, Rachel found herself seeing her city through Steve's eyes. He pointed out escape routes and potential vulnerabilities, but also noticed things like the homeless veteran sitting outside the bank, the mother struggling with 3 small children at the bus stop, the elderly man who looked confused and possibly lost near the shopping district. Steve had a way of seeing people, really seeing them, that Rachel realized she'd lost somewhere along the way to the top floor of her corporate tower. I have an idea, Rachel said as they stopped at a coffee cart near the park. It's probably crazy, and my board would have my head if they knew I was even considering it, but I think there might be a way to solve both our problems. Steve raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. I'm listening. What if I hired you as a consultant? Not for the security director position. That ship has sailed, and the board would never approve it now, but as an independent contractor to review our security protocols and make recommendations. It would give you work that actually uses your skills, and it would give me an expert assessment of whether our current security is adequate for what we're facing. You mean the threats from the lawsuit? Rachel nodded grimly. David Harrison isn't just suing me. He's making very specific threats about releasing what he claims is compromising information about the company. Information that could destroy us, even if it's fabricated. My current security team keeps telling me it's just bluster, but they said the same thing about the lawsuit itself. She paused, looking directly at Steve. I need someone who actually knows how to assess real threats, not just someone who knows how to write corporate policies. Steve considered the offer carefully. It wasn't the steady employment he desperately needed, but it was legitimate work that would pay well and potentially lead to other opportunities. More importantly, it would give him a chance to prove his worth to someone who had initially dismissed his qualifications. What about your board? Won't they object to hiring the guy they just rejected? They gave me authority to hire consultants without board approval, as long as the contracts are under a certain dollar amount. And technically, you wouldn't be an employee, just a contractor providing specialized services. Rachel's business mind was clearly working through the logistics. Besides, after this morning, I'm beginning to think my board doesn't always know what's best for this company. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. The woman who had been ready to end her life just hours earlier was now offering a lifeline to the man she'd previously rejected. The veteran who had been struggling to find his place in the civilian world was being offered a chance to use his skills for someone who finally understood their value. There's one condition, Steve said after a long moment. I do this my way. No corporate politics, no sugarcoating the truth, no worrying about hurt feelings. If I find problems, I tell you about them directly and honestly. If your current security team is incompetent, I'll say so. If your building is vulnerable, you'll hear about it. I won't be another yes man telling you what you want to hear." Rachel smiled, the first genuine smile Steve had seen from her all morning. "That's exactly what I'm looking for. Someone who cares more about doing the job right than protecting their position." She extended her hand formally. "Welcome to Harrison Tech, Mr. Miller, temporarily at least." As they shook hands outside the coffee cart, with the Denver skyline rising around them and the morning sun finally breaking through the clouds, both Rachel and Steve felt something shift inside them. It wasn't quite hope yet, but it was possibility. For the first time in months, they had something to work toward that felt meaningful and achievable. Neither of them realized that this handshake would be the beginning of something much larger than a simple consulting contract. Neither of them knew that David Harrison was watching from across the street, his face dark with anger as he photographed their meeting with a telephoto lens. And neither of them suspected that the real threats to Harrison Tech were just beginning to surface. 2 weeks into Steve's consulting contract, everything went sideways. He'd been making progress on his security assessment, identifying several critical vulnerabilities in Harrison Tech's systems, and building a rapport with Rachel that went far beyond their professional relationship. They'd been meeting daily to review his findings, conversations that often stretched long past business hours as they discovered shared perspectives on leadership, responsibility, and the weight of making decisions that affected other people's lives. Steve had also been spending evenings at Harrison Tech, observing the building's security protocols during different shifts and times of day. It was during one of these late-night assessments that he noticed the pattern. David Harrison, the former employee suing the company, had been conducting surveillance of his own. Steve spotted him 3 different nights, parked across the street with camera equipment, documenting who entered and left the building and when. When Steve brought this information to Rachel, she'd been incredulous. "He's watching the building? That's practically stalking. We should call the police." "Technically, he's on public property," Steve had explained. "But it suggests his lawsuit isn't just about money or revenge. He's gathering intelligence for something bigger." Steve's military instincts were screaming that this was reconnaissance for a larger operation. But he needed more evidence before making accusations that could backfire. That evidence came crashing down on them 3 days later. Steve was picking up Tommy from school when his phone exploded with missed calls and urgent text messages from Rachel. By the time he managed to call her back, her voice was shaking with barely controlled panic. "They have everything," she said without preamble. "Financial records, client communications, personnel files, even internal emails about the lawsuit. Someone hacked into our entire system and dumped it all online. The board is meeting in emergency session in 2 hours, and they're talking about my immediate resignation." Steve felt his stomach drop. This wasn't random cybercrime or opportunistic hacking. This was a coordinated attack designed specifically to destroy Rachel and the company. "Where are you now?" "My office. The IT team is trying to figure out how they got in, but it doesn't matter now. The damage is done. There are emails between board members questioning my competence, conversations with lawyers about settlement strategies, even my personal therapy sessions that were covered by the company health plan." Rachel's voice broke slightly. "Steve, there are things in those files that will destroy people's careers and marriages, ruin lives. And it's all my fault because I couldn't protect the company." "This is not your fault," Steve said firmly, already calculating drive times and childcare options. "This is a sophisticated attack by someone with inside knowledge and specific targets. I'm coming to the office." "No," Rachel said quickly. "Don't you understand? You're in those files too. Your consulting contract, our meetings, even security footage of us having coffee. Harrison's lawyer is already spinning this as proof that I'm emotionally compromised, hiring people based on personal feelings rather than professional qualifications. If you show up here now, it'll just make everything worse." Steve felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, the same helplessness he'd experienced when Lisa died and when he'd been forced out of the military. Once again, circumstances beyond his control were threatening to destroy something that mattered to him. But this time he wasn't going to accept defeat without a fight. "Rachel, listen to me. I've seen this playbook before, in the military and in corporate settings. This isn't random chaos. It's a calculated campaign designed to make you feel isolated and powerless. The hack, the timing, The specific targeting of embarrassing information? It's all designed to force you into making emotional decisions instead of strategic ones. What are you saying? I'm saying that David Harrison didn't do this alone. The technical sophistication, the legal coordination, the media timing, someone with serious resources, is backing this operation, and they're counting on you to panic and resign, which would hand them exactly what they want. There was a long pause before Rachel spoke again. Even if you're right, what difference does it make? The board has lost confidence. The media is having a field day, and our stock price has dropped 15% since the story broke. I'm finished. Steve made a decision that he knew could backfire spectacularly. Give me 48 hours. Don't resign. Don't make any permanent decisions. Just buy me 2 days to investigate this properly. If I can't find evidence that this was an orchestrated attack, then you can step down with dignity and I'll disappear quietly. But if I'm right, if there's a conspiracy here, then we fight back with everything we've got. Steve, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. The board isn't going to wait 48 hours. They want a decision today. Then stall them. Tell them you're consulting with crisis management experts. Tell them you're reviewing legal options. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. But don't give them the resignation they want until we know who's really behind this. After Steve hung up, he realized the magnitude of what he just promised. He had less than 2 days to uncover a conspiracy that professional investigators might take weeks to unravel, and he'd have to do it while maintaining his responsibilities to Tommy and avoiding any actions that could be construed as corporate espionage or illegal surveillance. That evening, after Tommy was asleep, Steve began what he privately called his reconnaissance mission. Using skills he'd learned in military intelligence and connections he'd maintained from his army days, he started tracing the digital footprints of the hack. The attack had been sophisticated, but every cyber operation left traces for someone who knew how to look for them. By midnight, Steve had identified several anomalies in the timing and methodology of the hack that suggested coordination with external parties. By 3 a.m., he'd traced IP addresses and server locations that pointed to a cybersecurity firm with known connections to corporate espionage. By dawn, he had a list of shell companies and financial connections that led directly back to Apex Industries, Harrison Tech's largest competitor. The picture that emerged was breathtaking in its scope and ruthlessness. David Harrison hadn't just been a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. He'd been a planted operative working for Apex Industries to gather intelligence and create opportunities for corporate sabotage. The lawsuit had been designed to distract Rachel and the board, while Harrison gathered the access credentials and system knowledge necessary for the cyber attack. The goal wasn't just to damage Harrison Tech's reputation. It was to force a leadership crisis that would allow Apex to acquire the company at a fraction of its actual value. But Steve's investigation had also revealed something else, something that made his blood run cold. The attack wasn't finished. The data dump had been just the opening move, designed to create chaos and vulnerability. The real attack was scheduled for that evening, during the board meeting where Rachel was expected to resign. While the executives were distracted by crisis management, Apex planned to launch a coordinated assault on Harrison Tech's client systems, causing catastrophic failures that would destroy the company's credibility and create legal liabilities worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Steve had the evidence to prove the conspiracy, but he also had less than 12 hours to prevent a cyber attack that would destroy innocent people's lives and livelihoods. And he couldn't do it alone. At 7 a.m., Steve called Rachel with everything he'd discovered. I need access to your building's security systems and your IT infrastructure, not as a consultant, but as someone with administrative privileges who can implement immediate countermeasures. Steve, even if the board believed everything you found, they'd never authorize that level of access for an outside contractor. The liability alone would be enormous. Then don't ask the board, Steve said quietly. This is your company, Rachel. Your father built it, your employees depend on it, and your clients trust it. Sometimes leadership means making decisions that other people won't understand until after the crisis is over. There was a long silence before Rachel responded. If we're wrong about this, if your evidence doesn't hold up, or if we can't stop the attack, then we'll both be finished. Not just professionally, but potentially criminally. Are you prepared for that? Steve thought about Tommy, about the life he was trying to build, about everything he could lose if this gamble failed. Then he thought about the employees at Harrison Tech, the clients who trusted the company with their data, and the woman who had been ready to end her life just weeks ago because she felt trapped and hopeless. "I've been prepared for that since the moment I decided to help you on that bridge," he said. "The question is whether you're ready to fight for something you believe in, even when the odds are against you." The board meeting erupted into chaos when Rachel presented Steve's evidence instead of her resignation letter. Charts and financial trails covered the conference room walls, showing the intricate web connecting David Harrison to Apex Industries. Several board members accused her of fabricating a conspiracy theory to save her position, but the digital forensics were undeniable. "This is happening right now," Steve explained to the room of skeptical executives. "While we're debating, their teams are positioning for the final attack. In approximately 3 hours, they'll trigger simultaneous system failures across 12 of your biggest clients, making it appear that Harrison Tech's security protocols are fundamentally flawed." Board member Patricia Wells leaned forward, her expression grave. "Even if we believe this, what can we possibly do? We're not equipped to fight a cyber war against a corporation with unlimited resources." Steve smiled grimly. "Actually, we are. Because they made one critical mistake. They assumed I was just a washed-up veteran playing security guard. They didn't realize I specialized in electronic warfare during my tours overseas, or that I still have contacts in military cybersecurity who've been tracking Apex's illegal activities for months." The next 4 hours transformed Harrison Tech's executive floor into a military command center. Steve coordinated with federal cybersecurity teams while Rachel managed crisis communications and legal strategies. The counterattack was surgical and devastating. Not only did they block Apex's assault, but they traced the intrusion back to its source, providing the FBI with enough evidence to launch criminal investigations against Apex's leadership. David Harrison was arrested at Denver International Airport attempting to flee to a non-extradition country with encrypted drives containing stolen data from dozens of companies. The arrest made national news, vindicating Rachel completely and exposing a corporate espionage network that had been operating for years. 6 months later, Steve stood in his new office on the 32nd floor of Harrison Tech, watching Tommy color at a small desk Rachel had installed specifically for after-school visits. The security director position had been officially created for him, with a salary that allowed him to stop worrying about rent and start planning for Tommy's future. "Daddy, why is Miss Rachel crying?" Tommy asked, looking toward the open door where Rachel stood with tears streaming down her face. "Happy tears, buddy," Steve explained, though he suspected there was more to it. The board had just voted unanimously to make Rachel's CEO position permanent, formally ending months of uncertainty about her leadership. Rachel wiped her eyes and smiled at Tommy. "Your dad saved my company, Tommy, and more importantly, he saved me." Tommy considered this seriously. "Did you say thank you?" "Many times," Rachel laughed. "But I think your dad deserves more than just thank you." Steve looked up from Tommy's dinosaur drawing to find Rachel watching him with an expression that made his heart race. Over the past months, their professional partnership had evolved into something deeper, built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and quiet moments stolen between crisis management and bedtime stories. "Rachel," Steve started, but she held up her hand. "I have something to ask you both," she said, kneeling down to Tommy's eye level. "Tommy, how would you feel if I became part of your family? Not just as your dad's friend, but officially." Tommy's eyes widened with excitement. "Like a mom." "If you'd want that," Rachel said softly. "I know I could never replace your real mom, but I love both of you very much, and I'd like to be your family if you'll have me." Tommy launched himself into Rachel's arms with such enthusiasm that he knocked over his crayon box. "Yes, Dad, can we keep her?" Steve laughed, his throat tight with emotion. "I think that's up to Miss Rachel. Are you sure you want to take on 2 Miller men? We're pretty high maintenance." Rachel stood, still holding Tommy, and reached for Steve's hand. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You two gave me a reason to fight when I thought I had nothing left. You became my family before I even realized that's what I was looking for." A year later, they stood together in the same spot where Steve had first talked Rachel down from the bridge. The city had installed a small memorial garden there, dedicated to suicide prevention and mental health awareness. Rachel had quietly funded the project, though she never sought credit for it. "Thank you," she whispered to Steve as they watched Tommy chase pigeons through the garden. "For stopping that morning." for seeing something in me worth saving." Steve pulled her closer, marveling at how completely their lives had transformed. "Thank you for giving me a reason to believe that second chances are real. That sometimes, the worst moments lead to the best outcomes." Tommy ran back to them, breathless and grinning. "Dad, can we get ice cream? Mom said she'd buy if you said yes." Steve raised an eyebrow at Rachel. "Mom, huh? When did that start?" "This morning," Rachel said proudly. "Officially, as of 10 minutes ago when the adoption papers were finalized." They walked toward the ice cream vendor together, a family forged from crisis and strengthened by choice. The bridge behind them stood as a reminder not of despair, but of the moment when two broken people chose to save each other. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.